Good morning, ladies and gentlemen in the room and online. My name is Khaldoun Azhari. I'm former president of this great club, member of the board, and also member of PAC committee, Professional Activities Committee, that organize such press conference. Today we have a very distinguished three experts, I would say, to tell us a lot about the situation and implication of the Gaza problems on the diplomatic, military, and other aspects in the maybe energy in the world, and especially in East Asia. Our guest speakers, starting from my very right, Mr. Koichiro Tanaka, Professor, Graduate School of Media and Governance, Keio University. And to his right is Mr. Tetsuo Kotani. He's Professor, Meikai University and Senior Fellow, Japan Institute of International Affairs. And to his right is Mr. Tom O'Sullivan, Director of Mathyos Global Advisory. And our event today, every speaker will speak for about 10 minutes, and then that will be followed by questions and answers. The language today will be in English. Thank you.
Okay, thank you. Well, good morning to you. I'll be first to speak today. I'll be talking mostly about how the Japanese government has been responding to the crisis that has erupted since October the 7th. Problem is, if you may have noticed, there have been some contradictory remarks given by the government officials or politicians, and also the media has been making their own kind of interpretation, which makes it quite difficult, but also, well, puzzling for all of us, even for me. And I'd like to dwell into how we can assess that, the HK. Now, we've seen several kinds of responses from our government. That is that there have been statements issued by the Foreign Ministry and other offices, and also our Foreign Minister as well, herself as well. And we've seen a sort of a G7 minus Japan and Canada, G7 minus Japan kind of forum issuing statements, whereas you can see that Japan is not present or in line with the others. Also, we've been talking to the Israeli ambassador here, and also with the Palestinian permanent representative of the ambassador, and as well as with the governments back at their home capitals. Okay. And the most interesting point was the UN vote that took place in the recent weeks, several of them in the Security Council chambers and the others in the General Assembly. All seem to have something in common, but sometimes contradicting each other, which gives us a sense that something is, well, really right, or something is really missing or wrong. Now, if we look back to the statement originally as issued by the Foreign Ministry's press secretary on the October 7th, it totally lacked the mention of terrorism, or the terror attacks. And that continued until the October 11th meeting with the Vice Minister for Parliamentary Affairs, with the Israeli ambassador here in Tokyo, when the foreign ministry or the government official of Japan finally admits to the nature of the attacks conducted by Hamas on the October 7th as terrorism. Okay, so there was this big question or moment of, not a moment, several days of vacuum, where people were wondering why we haven't called that kind of an attack as an act of terrorism and denounce it equivocally with other G7 members. Again, we need to be reminded that Japan holds the seat of the rotating presidency of the G7, the group of 7 for the year of 2023, whereas usually we would be expected to take the lead in such a case in trying to formulate kind of a joint statement to the concerned parties as well as to the international community, what needs to be done or what needs to be addressed. So there's a total vacuum for several days. Well, we haven't been doing exactly what the others have been doing. And even more, the G5 or the G6 statement that came out from the leaders of the other states, from the members of the G7 group. The first came on the October 7th, the other on the 23rd. In both cases, Japan was not included, or that we had, remained a sort of a distance from that statement. And that again comes under question why we have kept ourselves in a different position than the others. And of course, by October 12th, the G7 finance ministers meeting at Marrakesh came out with a statement condemning the attacks as act of terrorism. And we were taking the chair. So that means that Japan finally officially admits openly that the October 7th attacks by Hamas is an act of terror. So there is a shift in our position, and more interestingly is the UN vote. We have supported several of them. We have abstained from others, and also we have casted a no vote to other conditions as well. And in the end, as a nutshell, we see that what we're trying to achieve is the bottom line, as I understand, is that we finally do condemn the Hamas attacks as acts of terror, and we acknowledge Israel's right for self-defense. Yes, but with a big but, that it should be within the framework of the UN Charter. And so the the G5 and G6 statements come separately with the UN chambers. So we're trying to distance our, positions from the G5 and G6 since it's not within the framework of the United Nations charters. And of course, that holds a significant meaning to what extent the right of self-defense could be applied to, okay, to what extent. Now, there are also other, commonalities that we hold and share with other states, international community as well, is that we call for the respect of international law by all parties. We are concerned that the warfare or the conflict would, just only disrupt the lives of the innocent civilians in both sides of the separating line between Gaza and Israel. So we are calling for restraint, maximum restraint, as we usually do. So these are the commonalities that we can find, and that, I believe, is the bottom line that the Japanese government is trying to pursue. But yet, why did all these confusion happen? There are some scenarios and theories that I came up with. And first of all, we have been quite mindful of what happened in the past, especially in 1973, during the fourth round of the conflicts between Israel and the Arab states, followed by an OPEC resolution to boycott oil to those countries, states that support Israel. Of course, time is different. The conditions of the energy market is totally different. We don't see sort of a unity or homogeneous action from the Arab side to conduct such an act today. But still, that could have caused, a sort of a really cautious response from the Japanese government. Now, the second point is that, could be a little bit difficult for you to understand, but I came up with this theory trying to understand the discrepancies that exist over the reactions that the Japanese government has shown so far. That we need to, or we are trying to avoid using harsh languages or harsh wordings to condemn or to criticize our allies and friends, which are quite common in Japanese foreign policy and politics. And here, in the case, this is more applied towards the state of Israel. Yes, we have condemned the Hamas act as terrorism. We are also calling for the Israelis not to exceed their limits of the self-defense, but the right for self-defense. But the point is that in the past, we have seen in multiple cases, or in most cases, that Israel's response to acts of terrorism or terror far exceeds to that of the original damage and casualties that they have suffered. Maybe 10 times, 20 times the casualties on the side of the Palestinians, especially on the civilians. So we do not support that sort of an act. But if that happens, and if we are to condemn Hamas for their acts, or the Palestinians in general as a whole, of what they try to do, when they try to liberalize their own state or country, in the end, we will still need to start condemning Israel over the acts of what they do, when they overstep the right that is, well, actually, so could be that is proportionate to their damage that they have seen. The third point is the glitches within the Japanese government, that not all of the officials are well informed of the fact that's what's happening. And the most typical incident here is when the cabinet secretary was asked during his press briefing, daily press briefing, why Japan has not joined forces with other states of the G7, with the G6 or G5 statement. And his response was that, okay, these states are suffering from the issues of hostages taken by Hamas today, which does not actually tell the truth. It does not describe why we are away from this statement, simply because we've been asking foreign states in Europe, the Americas, Africa, Pacifics, everywhere in Asia, that to denounce the DPRK's hostage takings or the abduction of our Japanese nationals. We've been asking them to raise their voices against DPRK in a similar incident, hostage takings. Well, actually, they're not only hostages, they're abductees. But the government officials have been constantly raising their voices to join forces with us. And here, when the Europeans and the Americans are suffering from that similar incident, we stay away from that. It doesn't make sense. So this kind of a explanation actually does not apply. So there is a total discrepancy of what the government is saying, not actually doing, but saying. So in the end, I come up with this theory that everything mixed, from theory 1 to 3, all combined together has made the current condition of why we are so muddled in our response today. Well, gradually it's taking shape. And the bottom line, as I explained earlier, this is our position. And I hope and I believe that we could pursue this without any further dubious acts from our own. Okay, thank you for your attention.
Thank you very much. Kotani-san, please.
Well, good morning. So I will talk about possible security implication for Japan from the ongoing conflict between Israel and Hamas. So we are witnessing again a war between state and non-state actors. We have been seeing conflict between Russia and Ukraine since last year. And this is a interstate conflict, and this is a clear invasion by Russia against Ukraine. So it's relatively easy to say which is right and which is wrong. So it's basically a black or white conflict. But in the case of the conflict between Israel and Hamas, it's more difficult to say which is right and which is wrong. It totally depends on when you think the conflict started, on October 7th or 2021, 2014, 1973, or even 1948. So it's very difficult to say, which is wrong and which is right. But today, the biggest question is how Israel exercises its right to self-defense. Under the international law, when you exercise the right to self-defense, you need to consider the necessity and also the proportionality. But under the theory of deterrence, sometimes you have to be unproportional when you do retaliation. So in that sense, I think currently Israel is now facing the dilemma between the two. And the Israel government is now saying that their fundamental goal is the dismantlement of Hamas. So they are seeking the elimination of their enemy rather than the restoration of deterrence. And if so, we have to expect more damage, more suffering to the civilian population. And there's another challenge here. Israel as a state is bound by the international law, while Hamas, which is basically a terrorist organization, is not necessarily bound by the international law. So Hamas still continues the firing rockets against Israel, hiding in the civilian facilities, civilian buildings, and underground tunnels, and even in refugee camps. So Hamas is, in essence, using the civilian population as a human shield. So we just witnessed what happened to a refugee camp north of Gaza, where Israel conducted the airstrike, and which led to the explosion of the ammunitions of Hamas underground. So it is such a tragedy, and we may have to continue to see those events over time. And the international community is now calling for a ceasefire, but Japan, as well as the United States and other countries, are calling for humanitarian pause so that we can provide humanitarian assistance to the civilian population. Why we are not calling for ceasefire? Because if we call for ceasefire, the Hamas would be benefited, because Hamas doesn't have to follow through. So we are now calling for the humanitarian pause. And here we have to, Japan has to learn a lesson. So as conflict goes on, the international community called for ceasefire. In the case of Ukraine and Russia, already many countries are calling for ceasefire, even though Russia is occupying the territory of Ukraine. So as the global economy is damaged, and as the civilian population suffer, international community tend to call for ceasefire. So what if there's a war in Asia and Japan is attacked by neighboring countries? Perhaps Japan will try to respond to the attack, and we are now acquiring the counter-strike capabilities. But perhaps when we try to use those counter-strike capabilities, international community will call for ceasefire. So this is something Japan needs to prepare when we acquire the counter-strike capabilities. And my second point is the ongoing conflict in Gaza has a potential for escalation into a wider regional conflict. And the regional conflict in the Middle East is a nightmare for Japan's security. We have a kind of a trauma of the oil shock in 1973, Iran-Iraq war in the 1980s, and the Gulf War in the 1990s. So we don't want to see the escalation in the Middle East. But if the conflict escalates, we have to respond. And the first thing Japan has to do is the evacuation of our nationals in the Middle East. We have already evacuated Japanese nationals from Israel, but perhaps we have to do more from the entire region. And also we have to, if the conflicts expands, we have to consider how to protect our tankers from the Middle East to Japan. We are dispatching one destroyer and 2 patrol aircraft to Djibouti for counter-piracy operations. And in theory, we can utilize those assets for protecting our commercial shipping through the Middle East. But the 2015 peace and security legislation does not assume the protection of civilian ships. So under this law, the self-defense forces cannot protect the civilian ships. If there's any way for the self-defense forces to protect the civilian ships, which is the maritime security order, which the Prime Minister can make to the self-defense forces to conduct the law enforcement activities. But under the maritime security order, the self-defense forces can only protect the Japanese ships, and we cannot protect the foreign ships. But I can assume if there's a conflict, wider conflict, perhaps there will be an international coalition to protect the international shipping. But Japan has no legal foundation to join such an international coalition. And I think we have to address that. And plus, if the conflict widens, there's another concern for Japan. The United States is already facing 2 wars, one in Europe and one in the Middle East. But what if there's another one in Asia? Can the United States handle the 3 ongoing wars? That's a very big challenge and very big concern for Japan. We are not necessarily worried about the lack of US military forces in the Pacific. I think we have sufficient numbers of forces in the Pacific. You know, although the United States is now deploying 2 carrier strike groups in the Middle East, but at the same time, the United States is deploying 2 carrier strike groups in the Pacific as well. But the concern remains, particularly on the ammunition, the lack of ammunition. The United States has provided huge amount of ammunition to Ukraine. And now the United States is trying to support the Israel militarily. And although what Ukraine needs is different from what Israel needs, but there's something both countries need, which is the 155 millimeter ammunition. And the United States is already over capacity to produce. And this ammunition is also necessary in Asia if there's a war. So the lack of ammunition could be a great concern if there's a war in Asia. And lastly, there's a question of exit strategy. We are still not sure how Israel will end this conflict and what will be the end state of the Gaza Strip after the conflict. But reportedly, the United States and Israel are talking about possible coalition of willing peacekeeping in Gaza. We're not sure whether this is going to be a UN mandate or not, you know, given that fact the United Nations are not working quite well. But because of the 2015 peace and security legislation, Japan can now join a peacekeeping operation, even if it's not UN PKO. So we have a chance to join a peacekeeping operation in Gaza after the conflict. But there's still one condition remaining. There needs to be a ceasefire among the relevant parties. And otherwise, Japan cannot join. So there's still a political hurdle, but I think Japan has a better chance to contribute more to the post-conflict Gaza. So I'll stop here.
Go ahead, Tom.
Okay, thank you very much, Mr. Azari, for the invitation to speak here today, and Professor Tanaka and Professor Kotani, privilege being here on the stage with you as well today. Ladies and gentlemen, thank you also for coming to hear us today. And before I start to speak about the energy aspects of what is happening in the Middle East, I just wanted to offer my condolences to the families of all of the Israelis and the Palestinian people who have been killed over the last 27 days, including, of course, 27 journalists, as I understand it, have perished in Gaza over the last 27 days. And this compares with a figure of 70 in Ukraine over a period of almost 2 years. Anyway, ladies and gentlemen, I've been asked, Mr. Azari has asked me to speak about the energy aspects of the conflict. And I've prepared some charts here for you. This is the first chart that I have on the screen here today. It's actually an extract from the Financial Times, and you can see here that the World Bank is predicting that oil prices could go to $150. This is Ayaan Kose, one of the chief economists at the World Bank, who's a frequent visitor to Tokyo. And Martin Woods yesterday in the Financial Times also did some very good analysis on the impact of previous crises in the Middle East. And as you can see here, during the Kuwait invasion, when Saddam Hussein invaded Kuwait in 1991, and George Herbert Walker Bush responded to that, oil prices doubled. In 1973, during the oil embargo, oil prices were up 50%. The Iranian Revolution in 1979, you can see they were up almost 50% as well. Then the Libya civil war in 2014, 30%. We think over the last few weeks that oil prices, we call this a war premium, oil prices have probably risen by about $5 a barrel since the beginning of the crisis, or since the massacre happened on October 7th in Israel. And I've put that on the right chart here. And secondly, we just wanted to spend a little bit of time before I get into the Japan dependencies, the Middle East, of course, is a crucial energy arena, 30 million barrels of oil per day of production. Natural gas, huge producer of natural gas as well, 680 billion cubic meters. So about a third of the oil and gas consumed globally is produced in the Middle East. So any conflict there, as Kotani sensei said and Tanaka sensei said, will have huge repercussions, could have huge repercussions for the energy complex. In total, the region produces about 50 billion barrels of oil equivalent per year. And here I've outlined for you the Asian dependencies on oil. As you can see, China depends on the Middle East for about 50% of its oil. But more importantly, Japan has a 95% reliance on Middle East oil, which is a significant dependency on that region for its oil supplies. 20% more, I believe, than in 1973 during the Yom Kippur War. I want to talk a little bit about our friends in Thailand as well, since so many of them perished in southern Israel last week. Thailand has a 70% dependency on Middle East oil. And South Korea, our next door neighbors here, have a 60% dependence on Middle East oil. I've just put, this is my local gas station, the Enias station in Komazawa, where I refuel my motorbike once a week. But they have oil here at 170 yen a liter. So I think Japan provides significant subsidies for energy annually, and I think the number now is around $34 billion. And I think the Prime Minister is going to talk about this tonight when he delivers a press conference about his economic package, because my understanding is he's going to extend these subsidies for a longer period of time, at least until April 2024. And I want to talk a little bit about Israel itself. It's had a very successful last decade of energy discoveries. It operates 2 offshore natural gas fields, the Tamar field and the Leviathan field. And when Yafa Ben-Ari was the ambassador here, I had to help her a little bit to try and find some investors, Japanese oil and gas investors. So she would send me down to Marunouchi occasionally to speak to JAPEX and to ENEOS to actually source, to source some interest here. And I'm sure Ambassador Cohen is doing the same thing. But most of a lot of Israeli natural gas, obviously used domestically, but a lot of it was exported to Egypt in a pipeline. And unfortunately, after the October 7th massacre, this pipeline completely ceased operation. And 2 days later, Egypt ran out of piped natural gas. And the ironic thing about that as well is that around 30% of Egyptian natural gas is exported to Asia. Taiwan actually buys 10% of Egyptian LNG. So our friends in Egypt are very important for us here, and Japan and South Korea also import 5% of Egyptian LNG, liquefied natural gas. So about 30% comes here to this time zone. On the third slide here, I just documented for you some of the choke points adjacent to Israel. Of course, you have the Suez Canal, which is about 1,000 kilometers south of Israel, and about the same distance as between Fukuoka and Tokyo. And next to Djibouti, where Japan has a base, you obviously have another major choke point, the Bab el-Mandeb Strait, and further east, of course, the Persian Gulf. So about 5 million barrels of oil go through the Suez every day, and there's 2 pipelines that take oil into the Mediterranean from the Red Sea as well. So that's a crucial artery for energy transmission from the Gulf into Europe and into the US as well, because the United States is buying oil from the Middle East. And through the Strait of Hormuz, about 30 million barrels of oil go every day. So again, a very, very crucial artery. I was going to mention as well that Japan has this huge reliance on Middle East oil, mainly because of the Russian illegal invasion of Ukraine by Russia, when Japan had to sanction the Russians, for invading a fellow European country. So please don't forget that. And one important aspect as well is that China is importing about 2 million barrels of Iranian oil. So this could become an issue as well if Iran gets more involved in the conflict. And about South Korea, as I said, has a 60% reliance on Middle East oil. And as well, they have built 4 nuclear reactors in the UAE, so they have a very close relationship with the Middle East. And some of you may know, President Yoon has just returned from a trip to Saudi Arabia, where he signed several deals with Mohammed bin Salman on petrochemical plants in Saudi Arabia and in Korea. And just to get on, obviously, people are very concerned about the climate aspects. So the Institute for Energy Economics in Japan has just also issued a report saying that Japan will still be relying on fossil fuels for 50% of its primary energy requirements in 2050, when we were supposed to be carbon neutral. So I think we need to take that up with Japan in due course. And also, of course, just to mention that COP28 will be taking place in late November in the United Arab Emirates, and the chairman of ADNOC will be chairing that, Ahmed Al-Jaber, and President Assad of Syria has been invited to that as well for the first time. So we have to see how that evolves, given that there is this major conflict going on in the Middle East. And I didn't mention the choke point here as well. Obviously, the Strait of Malacca, all of Japan's energy, natural gas and oil goes through the Strait of Malacca between Indonesia and Malaysia. And as you may know, the Japanese Prime Minister, I think, will be in Malaysia later this week. So you can see here also just the concentration of energy facilities. So as Tanaka-sensei said, and as Kotani-sensei said, if there is any major problems or an escalation of the conflicts in the Middle East, then obviously the place is ripe for targets, for terrorist targets. So this is a list of the oil and gas facilities around the region. And we shouldn't forget that, you know, there have been several instances where terrorism has taken place. In 1980, 1988, you had the tanker war when the Iran-Iraq war happened. 2010, a Japanese oil tanker was attacked in Hormuz. 2019, Iran attacked oil facilities in Saudi Arabia. And in 2021, a South Korean tanker was detained. And of course, we should mention that the $6 billion that was released recently to Iran had come from Korean Bank. And I just wanted to finally say as well that, you know, I think it's time maybe for Japan to consider its energy security. It has significant reliances on the Middle East. Japan, in the post-Fukushima environment, has only restarted 12 of its nuclear reactors. So there is the possibility that Japan should seriously consider new technologies, new nuclear technologies, to reduce the reliance on other countries. And of course, we could be faced also with a blockade. And Koji Indo, an autos analyst, was here recently saying that it would potentially be very difficult to electrify Japan's transportation fleet if we don't have more electricity, nuclear-generated electricity. Slide 6, I just wanted, as I'm from the Republic of Ireland, I just wanted to put Mary Robinson's picture here. She's a former president of my country, and she was head of the United Nations Human Rights Authority for several years. She's here pictured on the left with the Prime Minister of Palestine in Ramallah, in the West Bank, with Ban Ki-moon. Both of them are now 79 years old. So I think these people could play, hopefully, a peacekeeping role in the future. And on the right side, you can see Mary Robinson with President Herzog. And just to mention as well how international a country Israel is, Herzog's father, Chaim Herzog, who was the 6th president of Israel, was born in Ireland. He was born in Belfast in 1918 during the First World War. So, you know, there are very close connections between Europe and Israel. I will, if that's okay, and his mother, I should mention, his mother is Egyptian as well. So huge interconnections there. So thank you, Calden. I'll stop there if that's all right. Thank you.
Thank you, Tom, for this historical background. I'd like to open the floor to Q&A. If you have any question, please raise your hand and proceed to the front mic and state your name and affiliation first, please. And make your question short, please. Thank you.
Nishimura Freelance, thank you very much. I have two questions. One is to Mr. Tanaka. In terms of response of Japanese government, Prime Minister Kishida reiterated that Japan has the relationship with both of two, which means Israel and Palestine. So, does this mean Japan has a special relationship with those countries? Do you see any special opportunity to Japan to play a role of reaching to both of two countries? Not countries and regions. And second is to Mr. Kotani-san. And in terms of lack of ammunition of the United States, I think it can be imaginable before the attack of Hamas to Israel. So do you see this attack of Hamas related to the situation of Ukrainian and Russian war? Thank you very much.
Yeah, well, thank you for your question. Yes, well, it's been a while that we haven't seen sort of a unique foreign policy conducted by Japan. This may be one exceptional case that haven't been seen for years, maybe decades. But yet, having said that, I still fear that our hands are quite tied with our relationship with the United States and the conditions or security situations here in East Asia. But since we are still the chair of the G7, as well as the non-permanent member of the Security Council for the year of 2023 and 24, there is an opportunity, there isn't a window open for that. Only thing is that maybe we haven't come up with the brightest idea for a solution or remediation. And the problem here with the Security Council, as we've been already have seen, is that either sides, the United States or, of course, Russia and China, have the veto powers, and nothing may move forward. I feel really disappointed with that condition, but seems like that is the reality that we are facing.
Thank you. Konami-san.
Well, reportedly, the Hamas started the planning of this attack 2 years ago. So before Russia decided to invade Ukraine. So I don't see a direct connection. But as a result, both Ukraine and Israel is now facing a lack of ammunition from the United States. But Israel is in a better position because they have a much stronger military asset. So I think the Ukraine would be suffering more from the current situation.
Thank you. Yes, please.
John Getty from Reuters. Given what you've said about Japan not joining certain G7 statements or G7-1, G7-2 statements, and the differences with voting amongst G7 members at UN resolutions, do you envisage it will be difficult for the G7 foreign ministers who are going to be here in Tokyo next week to reach a common statement, a common communique on this crisis? And where do you see sort of the differences or the most contentious issues in terms of that language? And a sort of follow-up question to that would be, what's the relevance of the G7 in this particular crisis? How important is their response? Thank you.
I think that's interesting, right? Thank you for your question. The difference is, I believe, lies in the text of how the right for self-defense for the Israelis would be articulated in any kind of statement or communique. It would be difficult even for now, Japan to admit to a G7 statement that would specifically talk about the right for self-defense for Israel only, where the right for self-defense for the Palestinians are totally neglected from the beginning. And that's a big problem. And also, without what just Kotani Sensei had mentioned and explained, the proportionate responses or the proportionate action that is admitted under the right for self-defense, if it's not there contained under the UN charters or any reference to the United Nations charters, I think that would be difficult for Japan to accept or incorporate it in the G7 statement or the communique that may happen or may not happen. Relevance of the G7, yes, is totally under question. I believe even during the Hiroshima summit earlier this year, it has already come under scrutiny because not that they failed. It's mostly because of the Arab League summit that was conducted simultaneously by Saudi Arabia in Jeddah at the same time, and also the Chinese holding a summit with their Central Asian partners simultaneously. I mean, in previous decades or years, I believe that the rest of the world at least had paid some sort of an attention to what the G7 would agree upon, and later they would convene their own kind of summits and come up with their own ideas or response. Now, this year, it appeared to me as though that they no longer care about the G7.
Thanks. All right. I received a question online, just directly to me. It says, especially Kotani-san, the word terrorist in most Arab countries is directed at Israel, not at Hamas, because they say Hamas is an organization that seeks liberation of its occupied land, and they have the very right to liberate their land in the way they see fit. That's what most Arab media actually saying. And they say Israel is an occupation, and there are over 100 UN resolutions against Israel, all rejected by Israel. And also Israel annexed the Syrian Golan Heights, and nothing happened. So all of these actions, and yet you are saying it's a gray area, who is right and who is wrong between Hamas and Israel. And they say why it's a terrorist when it's a terrorist act when Hamas attacks the occupation, but it's liberation act when Ukraine fight the occupation. Actually, this is what you read in daily Arabic media every day. So what is your response to this? Thank you.
Well, so we need a clear standard to understand what's going on. And, you know, the modern international system is based upon the international law and international rules. And one of the basic ideas or norms we have to respect is the peaceful resolution of the dispute. So on one hand, of course, we have to condemn the Hamas doing a brutal attack and killing of civilian population. But at the same time, we have to condemn Israel's settlement in the West Bank. So we have a very clear standard, which is the rules-based international order and the peaceful settlement of dispute. So as long as we stick to this norm, we can handle any conflict. But in reality, there's always people or groups who prefer not to be bound by this standard. So one thing we have to do is continue to condemn those who are against the very basic of our international system.
Thank you. More question, if you still have. Yes, please.
Hi, Alex Wilson with Stars and Stripes. For Kotani-san, I wanted to ask, you mentioned that Japan could potentially join peacekeeping efforts in the conflict, but beyond a general desire to support their allies and peace in the region, what would motivate Japan to partake in something like that, considering other security threats to Japan, such as China and North Korea? And then briefly, if I could just ask a second, Mr. O'Sullivan, in the scenario of a significant energy shortage, what immediate options would Japan have to make up that shortage?
So thank you. So the very reason the Japanese government enacted the 2015 peace and security legislation was to play a greater role in the international community. We understand what's going on far away could have a direct impact on the security of Japan. So we wanted to increase our options to play a greater role in the international community. So I would imagine if there's a need for the peacekeeping operation in Gaza, for example, I do think the Japanese government would join that peacekeeping operations, even if there's a security concern in the neighborhood.
Yeah, and thank you for your question. As for the energy issues and potential shortages, as I mentioned, I mean, only 12 of Japan's nuclear reactors, 33 nuclear reactors have been restarted. So one option for Japan, of course, is to try to accelerate that. That's been quite slow. We're now 10 years after the Fukushima accident, and really not too many people died as a direct result of what happened at the nuclear site in Fukushima. And one other thing, as I mentioned as well, a lot of new technologies are being developed. United States is investing in new nuclear technologies. Fusion is one potential option. We discussed that recently in Japan. So we think that Japan also needs to seriously consider that, especially in these circumstances. Of course, as well, clean energy, solar and wind power. Japan is continuing to invest heavily in those areas. But as you will appreciate, they're intermittent, and higher interest rates seem to be creating quite a bit of turmoil in that industry. So we think it's best that they consider, the options that they already have here in the nuclear sphere. Thank you.
Yes, more questions if you have. All right, let me ask a question I received from Watanabe Shinya. International standards are important to follow. We agree. That's for Mr. Kotani. However, Japan still say Russia is occupying Japanese northern islands or territories, but Russia rejects this. We are with Japan to get back the Japanese land. Don't you think this is the same standard we should follow to get back Palestinian occupied territories from Israel and in the occupation? Thank you. It's almost the same question.
Well, in the case of northern territories, we are sticking to the peaceful dialogue with Russia. Although the territorial negotiation is going nowhere at this moment, but we have no intention to use of force to take back northern territories, and actually this is prohibited under the Japanese constitution. So although I do think the Palestinians have the hope to take back the territory from Israel, but you have to stick to a peaceful means, not striking against the civilian population in Israel. The only way we can accept is the peaceful negotiation.
Thank you. Yes. All right. Let me turn to Tom. Tom, about the energy situation, why is that Japan depends on the Middle East for over 95% of its oil imports? And there is also no chance now to generate more energy from the nuclear plants because of mostly the opposition among Japanese people. So is there any chance Japan would reduce the energy, the oil dependence in the next 5 years or even 10 years?
Yeah, Keldon, for your first question about the extreme dependency that Japan has on Middle East oil, as I said, it's probably due to the Russian illegal invasion of Ukraine by Russia, because Japan used to buy Russian oil previously, but obviously after the sanctions that had to stop. And let me also mention that Japan is still importing natural gas from Sakhalin, so that's also potentially problematic in the future. But I think slowly Japanese public is coming around to the idea that Japan needs nuclear power. South Korea is operating 24 reactors. They're exporting their capabilities, as I said, to the United Arab Emirates, and President Yoon has just come back from a pretty fruitful discussion in Saudi Arabia with the authorities there. The Saudis want to build 16 reactors. So I think the Japanese public is coming around to the idea of more investments in nuclear power, and also, of course, there is the cost issue. If they don't do that, then they're going to be paying very expensive prices for their electricity, for natural gas, and potentially oil as well, especially if Mr. Kosei in the World Bank is correct and it goes to $150 a barrel. That would be potentially catastrophic for Japan, especially if the exchange rate is 150 to the dollar, as it is at the moment. And Japan is, top of class in terms of efficiency, energy efficiency. So it's difficult to see what else they could achieve there. But we must remember as well that this is an industrial economy, and we need, base load capacity in this country. So that's why we think nuclear power, especially the new nuclear technologies, are potentially a solution for Japan.
Go ahead.
Koichiro, yes.
Yes,
Thank you.
I mean, if I may. Yes, the reason why we are still importing huge amounts of oil from the Middle East, there are several reasons to that. But let us not forget that the volume that we are picking up today is much less, far less than we used to 20 years ago. 20 years ago, it was in the order of 5 million barrels per day. Now it's in the order of 3 point several. Sometimes it's below 3. So we have reduced the amount of oil that we burn or use, while we are still, maintaining our daily lives. So efficiency, just like Tom right now mentioned, it has been a major contributor to that reduction. But still, the dependency towards the Middle East, comes from one point. The volume that they are able to generate and to produce and to export is very attractive, and that we have long-term contracts with most of the countries in the Middle East. So it is a very stable source of supply that we can rely on when it comes to oil, and that is the major reason. Yes. And one thing about nuclear, yes, new technologies, I believe in technology developments, yes. But here in Japan, we have seismic activities here and there, and I do not believe that there is much land left for any kind of new nuclear reactors to be built here. Yes, sorry.
Thank you. I think we still have time for our last question. All right, let me take advantage of Koichiro-san, maybe later. How about the Iranian role in this crisis in Gaza? There's a lot of talk about whether Iran is coordinating with Hamas or not, and whether Hezbollah is going to enter the war or not. What's the situation there, and how do you anticipate the prospects?
Right.
Thank you.
Well, there are a lot of variants working here, so the answer may not be simple. But with the initial attacks by Hamas on October 7th, mostly the intelligence community in the West and others have come to sort of an agreement on how they see the situation, that Iran was not directly involved for that, and Iran also denies that. But if we look back to history and also to the future, I do still believe, and also the Iranians do admit to that they have supported Hamas, they have supplied Hamas, they have assisted Hamas in developing their rocket technologies or missile technologies, or whatever they have in hand. Possibly they have transferred North Korean ammunition and others that the Iranians have bought in favor of Hamas and other resistance groups in the Middle East and transferred them to these groups. That's also possible. So in the end, after all these wars, conflicts, the mess comes to an end, hopefully, not before long, there will be an international, pressure against Iran. Further sanctions, further isolations, whatever happens, they would be held responsible, not entirely, but a huge amount, a lion's chunk of the damages and all these warfares that have happened at least until today, for the past 3 weeks. So Iran knows that very well, and they're also trying to use this opportunity in their favor. Now, if the conflict is to come to an end before any further destruction of the Gaza Strip, as well as the Hamas dismantlement happens, it is quite true that Iran, along with Hamas, would come out of this conflict as a winner. They haven't suffered anything. Iran hasn't suffered anything. They won't suffer anything as long as they see that, okay, the normalization talks between the Kingdom of Saudi Arabia and Israel is now put on hold, as they wish to. They see that the Israeli air defense system is not as tight as it was supposed to, and they see the vulnerabilities of Israel here and there. And they have seen that, just like Kotani Sensei has mentioned, the ammunition of Israel has now come, not totally ended, but the storage is now draining down. So it would end up as though that Iran has won a battle without actually fighting or having direct hands in it. So again, that would lead Israel and the United States and the rest not to allow Iran to walk out of this without any damage.
Thank you. Yes.
Mostly the same question as Colin. My question is: there's a report from Middle East that attacks from the Yemen or attacks preparing the attack of Hezbollah. So how likely is this conflict spread around the Middle East?
Was it from
Well, so those Iranian proxies are doing lots of harassment and even attacks on the U.S. bases in the region. And at this moment, I think their intention is to dissuade the Israel full-scale ground invasion of Gaza. But if Israel continues the ground invasion in a larger sense, then there's a possibility that the organizations such as Hezbollah will open up a second front. And then the situation became very difficult to control. So there's always a chance of misperception, miscalculation. So we have to be cautious about the prospect. But at this moment, the United States is very much determined to deter the escalation by sending lots of military assets in the region. So hopefully the Iranians will be deterred by the U.S. But nobody can be sure.
And if I could just mention one thing, of course, in Syria and in northern Iraq, as I understand it, U.S. facilities have suffered over 20 attacks. This does not seem to be getting a lot of publicity, and this is also an important energy producing area. Iraq produces 4 to 5 million barrels of oil every day, major global suppliers and exporters of oil. So I think we need to watch carefully what's going on in Syria and around the Mosul area as well. Because there seems to be quite a bit of IS activities in those areas.
Thank you. I think this is it for today's event. Thank you very much again for coming. Thank you for providing us with your insights. We appreciate that, and I think we will meet again to talk about this issue in the near future. Thank you and have a nice evening. Thanks. Please give a big hand to that.